Hello and welcome to The Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by SpectatorTV and broadcast on this Thursday, the 5th of October 2023. My name is Freddy Gray. I'm the Deputy Editor of The Spectator and I will be your host today. We're going to be focusing quite heavily on politics, and I won't say I'm afraid because it has been a big political week. The Tory party conference has just happened. The Labour Party conference is coming up. I'll be joined first of all by Katy Balls, our politics editor, and the author Anthony Seldon to discuss how the week went for Rishi Sunak and his administration. There's Katy's cover piece here, which I will hold up again, no doubt. And after that, we'll move on and talk to Tim Stanley, the Telegraph's Tim Stanley, about the state of conservatism and ask the important question, what have the Conservatives actually been doing for the last 13 years? And then we'll be moving a little bit from the political towards the spiritual and be talking about Anglican bishops in the House of Lords and their bias towards the Labour Party. I'll be joined by James Heale to discuss that topic. And lastly, are you a workaholic? Apparently almost everyone is these days. I'll be joined by the Spectator's workaholic, Douglas Murray, to talk about why he is so unlazy. But before we get going, I would like to thank our sponsors, our brilliant sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, for supporting our show. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who offer unwavering support in these challenging times. Visit candowealth.com for more information about them. Well, let's talk about the big story of the week first, and that is the Tory party conference. Our cover piece is inevitably about it. Battle begins, Katy Balls on the coming contest. I'm joined by Katy now, our politics editor, who's written that piece, and the author Anthony Seldon, who has written seven prime ministerial biographies. Katy, first of all, congratulations on writing this piece, because I was there not as long as you were at the conference, and you seem to be doing endless events and mingling, and I'm not sure when you managed to do it, but it's a very, very fine article that sums up the state of British politics rather well. Let's talk first about the speech, because obviously that's the big set piece. And I think it's fair to say it wasn't quite the disaster that a lot of people thought it would be, but perhaps it hasn't set the world on fire.
Yes, I think that is fair in the sense that you had lots of talk ahead of the speech, because what ultimately happened was a few weeks ago, a very keen snapper, caught a glimpse or in a photo of a government document suggesting that HS2 was being looked at by the government. That then led to multiple stories about whether the second leg of HS2 could be scrapped. And when it got to the conference, every interview, including those of the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Transport Secretary, became, well, we're in Manchester. If you're scrapping the route Birmingham to Manchester, why didn't you just say? And it meant that in the days ahead of the speech, it was a bit of a Groundhog Day for the Conservative Party conference. And when Rishi Sunak got up to speak, I think people thought all hell could break loose really in the Tory party if he were to announce this. And people such as myself, I think even said on this, who would be, for all of Rishi Sunak wanting to talk about hard truths, would he really scrap something for Manchester in Manchester? No, it turns out the answer was yes. As Rishi Sunak tries to pitch himself as this change candidate, something Keir Starmer also wants to do, I think he almost is quite happy to lean in to where there are some disagreements, to where there is some friction. So there were three main announcements. He confirmed axing that part of HS2. There's also a plan to slowly phase out cigarette use, starting with 14-year-olds. And then finally, there's a plan to scrap A-levels and bring in a new degree. Now, I think for Rishi Sunak, to your point, Fred, he thinks these are really big radical policies and therefore are going to capture the agenda. And I think they are getting lots of people talking. Is it enough to change things and mean that the public see him differently? I think the jury is out on that. And also they are divisive, within parts of the Tory party. For example, I think the cigarette ban is probably the most internally Tory divisive. It probably plays better with the general public and some Labour voters than Tory voters. And HS2 has seen David Cameron come out and be withering time after that. But the view in number 10 is effectively, we're going to say at least Rishi Sunak stands for something. You might not like what he stands for, but he stands for something. And they're going to say Keir Starmer doesn't.
Yes, Anthony, I wonder about that. The smoking ban is referred to as a talking point. And of course, HS2 was a very big talking point. But there's a suspicion that Rishi Sunak's administration are quite happy with talking points like those, because that means not talking about very substantial problems with the economy, with the NHS, and with other aspects of transport, and generally the sense that British society, Britain as a country, is not working very well. Do you have that sense?
So I think he is doing the only thing that he can do, which is to present himself as the candidate of change. Let's remember the context here is that no party since the birth of modern British democracy in 1832 with that Reform Act has won 5 general elections in a row. And there's a reason for that there are common factors that come to bear and make it very difficult for that party. And so I think he's done well. I mean, I'm talking here as a head teacher in part from the head's study at Epsom College, where I am the head. And I think the A-level is absolutely right and long overdue. 70 years it is a good, fair run for A-levels. Britain was a totally different place when 70 years ago it was devised. We need to move towards a broader, more modern examination system, call it British Baccalaureate, what you will. And I think he's right about education. And I think he's right to give urgency in education, which the Tories did very well at the beginning of the 13, 14 years under Michael Gove, under David Cameron as Prime Minister, gave it huge urgency. And I think he's right to return to it, because there have been 10 education secretaries in the last 10 years, which is, of course, absurd. And I think, I like what he's saying about smoking, and the HS2 decision and pushing back on the rate of greenification of Britain are sensible politics, even if they're not always sensible policy. I get all that. But, it's not going to be down to what he does or doesn't do, and it hasn't been so in the past. Let's just, if I've got time, just to mention 3 very quick factors, and then you can come back and ask about them if you want to. I mean, the first is that drags down long-serving governments of left and right is the feeling is all beginning to unpick and unthread from the inside that Katy talks about in her really excellent article. And she mentions Liz Truss strutting around at the party conference. You mentioned David Cameron's speech. Is it just the beginning of what happens as the party becomes much less interested in the losing prime minister than who might take over? That's the first thing that unravels a long-serving government. Second is obviously the state of the economy, over which the prime minister and number 10 and the Treasury have surprising little control. I mean, I say surprising, it shouldn't be a surprise, because so much of the state of the economy is decreed by forces outside their control. And the third is the zeitgeist, just the sense that, it's time for a change, and we don't really know who this other person is or party or what they might do, as long as they're not too scary. We just need to have anybody. And there's a sense of staleness and corruption, boredom. So I think those are the big 3, tantamount disloyalty, the economy, and time for a change that will matter far more than his, I think, brave and correct politics, which is to try and be the change candidate and to create difficulty for Labour next week by really bowling curveballs at the Starmer team.
You say the A-level reform is long overdue, and you were at a conference of head teachers this week. I wondered, do most head teachers share your view? I know there's some concern in conservative circles that there's been too much tinkering with qualifications, with exam systems, and it's never really turned out very well.
I think if you get 300 independent school heads together in a conference room, you'll come up with 301 different opinions. And that's precisely why they've become heads, because they do have opinions. But there's a general sense that it is anomalous for Britain to have such a narrow curriculum at the 16 to 18 age, that most other countries have a broader baccalaureate type of system, and that having English and maths all the way through to the end of school is important for whatever careers, and having a greater sense of a focus on entrepreneurship and creativity, more practical education, and bringing together practical and academic education. So I think the Prime Minister and his team have done well in all of that. And inevitably it's going to divide the education community, as it always does. But 70 years for any exam system, I mean, that's a heck of an innings.
Right. Katy, the battle lines are drawn, as you say, but mainly on the Tory side now, because of course we've got Labour Party conference next. What are you hearing about how Labour might respond? I mean, there's some talk today that with HS2, Rishi Sunak has actually given them a problem, because are they going to oppose it when there are actually pockets of support in quite strong Labour areas for scrapping HS2 if it means more investment in transport? So has he stolen a bit of their thunder?
I think he's definitely left them with some questions to answer. And well, you're stealing the thunder. It depends how they do so. Of course, this is the first time in a very long time that Labour conference has taken part after Tory conference. And while I think most people aren't sitting at home watching the conferences minute by minute, it does have some impact, at least on, I think, how the political landscape looks. Because right now it means for, one of the first times, Labour are going to have to respond to the Tories, but Labour will get the last word. So imagine in a week's time saying, oh, well, Rishi Sunak, who even remembers that conference, if it goes well for Labour, that's what they want to do. But there are questions, as you say, on HS2. Rachel Reeves wants to be very careful with the finances and keep saying no to all these spending requests from her shadow cabinet. So were Labour to come out and say, we will press ahead with part 2 of HS2, that's 36 billion that cannot be spent in other areas, such as some of these new projects. Rishi Sunak has announced lots of projects. I think some seem more sturdy than others after 24 hours, since he's talked about them. But the point is, you could have, local councillors saying, well, the Tories are currently committing to this project in my area, and if you stick with HS2, are you going to do that? So I think there's some things there. I think the cigarette one, in a way, isn't too political. The only thing is, perhaps Labour would have announced it. So has Rishi Sunak beaten them to it? And Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, has already spoken quite supportively of it. So, and it's a free vote because it's a conscience matter. So I'd be surprised if that is something where they make too much hay with it. And then on education, I think the Labour will have their own policies. But I think when it comes to Labour's battle lines, speaking to figures ahead of this conference, so for example, Rachel Reeves in her speech is going to try and pitch it as an economic choice to Anthony's point by saying that the choice is stability, including the economy. This is the Shadow Chancellor speaking, with Labour, or risking another 4 or 5 years of chaos with the Tories. And I think you'll hear lots of talk of, who got a bigger queue at Tory conference, Liz Truss or Jeremy Hunt? And therefore, I think where Labour is more comfortable, at least for now, is actually making their dividing lines on personality and party rather than policy. They do have some policies that are different to the Tories. If you think about green energy, if you think about workers' rights. But I think where Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves feel the most confident is trying to just drag Rishi Sunak down as being part of a Tory party that is just filled with infighting. And I think that's going to be a big theme.
And Anthony touched on a very important word in politics, which is boredom. And if you look at these battle lines that are being drawn out, we've discussed this before on Spectator TV, I think, that it's looking like the next election is going to be something of a bore off. with both leaders trying to present themselves as stable, pragmatic, and won't do anything to really sort of disturb anything, when at the same time the public are crying out for change and for a different kind of politics. Who do you see winning a bore-off at the moment?
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting about that is, as you say, Freddie, both parties have clocked onto the fact that the public really want change, but yet they really want to do it on their terms. So Rishi Sunak is doing it in quite a technocratic, Rishi Sunak way of taking risk, and they are bold on their own terms. But it is a far cry, I think, from Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament and so forth. And Keir Starmer wants to be changed, but not too much like change, so as to scare any voters. So they keep talking about it, but it isn't anything too drastic, I think, from voters' perspectives. When we were looking at the different cartoons ideas to go on the cover this week, there was two kind of almost wind-up doll versions of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, which I think did allude to the fact this could be a less exciting election. And I think the Jeremy Corbyn versus Boris Johnson 2019 election is going to feel so different to this. I think it's probably the first election where, even if the Tories try and weaponise Brexit a bit because of Keir Starmer's past, it is not going to be a Brexit election first and foremost, and therefore will perhaps feel a bit more like 2015. But when you come down to, I suppose, to which party has the easiest job saying they are change, it is going to be Keir Starmer, even if it is going to be a very flat election, just in the sense that 13 years is hard to rub aside.
Change, not chaos, is what both people are trying to present. Actually, I wonder if we could talk about the media culture and politics, because you have people like Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak trying to talk about sort of stability in politics and serious issues, trying to be serious grown-ups and so on. But you also have the BBC obsessing over Liz Truss's event, which was an interesting wrinkle, was an interesting story, and talking a lot in the BBC and a lot of other media talking about the far right takeover of the Conservative Party. I don't think I'm biased in saying I don't think that's a fair reflection of what was going on at conference. Is the problem slightly that whatever the Tories say, the media culture is going to focus on things that are unhelpful to them?
So the media, Freddie, very, very broadly, the papers are going to look at the headlines today, Thursday, I'm sure all the way into the weekend, will be broadly supportive of the Conservatives. And the broadcasters will be broadly supportive of Starmer, obviously with the fracturing away from the grip of the BBC, with all kinds of new media outlets and social media. I mean, every general election, it becomes more and more difficult to predict and to control the media, which is precisely why the two operative figures in this election will be Isaac Levido managing the campaign for the Conservatives, and Deborah Masson and all the pollers around Starmer, because everything that they breathe and utter, as we know, is designed by focus groups, because this is such a vital general election for both of them, which isn't. I think I agree totally with Katy that coming second is much better. That the Tories, I'm sure, hope to do what happened with inheritance tax that so mucked up Gordon Brown and his hopes for an early general election when he took over in 2007, for those who can remember back that far. And I agree with Katy that it hasn't quite gone that far. There's nothing like that spoiler in the spoilers that have come out of the Tory Party conference this week. It is going to be a sense of safety first, as the 1929 general election was. And I agree also that interestingly, Brexit, we're not going to, thank goodness, hear a lot about Brexit, I don't think, in this general election. It is going to be, it's going to be exactly as I said at the beginning. It's pretty largely out of Rishi Sunak and Team Sunak's hands. It will be the three factors that I mentioned at the beginning: the economy, and the divisions within the Tory party, Kemi Badenoch, Liz Truss, others who feel that Sunak got the premiership by the back door and unfairly, and that sense that it really is time for a change, and all the muddle and the relatively low achievement of the Tories. And that, of course, is not totally their fault, because there was global financial crisis, there was the Brexit, there was COVID, and the Ukraine war, and the inflation impact of that. I mean, it's unusual for a period of 13 years, 14 years of any government of one party to have so many external factors knocking the achievement off course. But the result is that it has been a pretty low achieving 13, 14 years for any one party, much lower than the Tories between 1951 and 64 with 4 PMs, or Labour between 1997 and 2010 with just the 2 PMs. They've had 5 PMs, and I can't count how many different secretaries of state. My maths isn't that good. I should be better as a head, I know.
You'd need an advanced A level in mathematics to figure out all the various.
I would have been a beneficiary of the British back and been made to do maths, and then I could have counted that high.
Anthony and Katy, we will end it there, but thank you both very much for coming on to Spectator TV. And Katy, you should get some rest. Now, as we've just alluded to, one of the Tories' great problems is that, if not their greatest problem, is that they've been in power for 13 years. And quite a lot of the country doesn't really think they've done much good. Tim Stanley, the Telegraph's Tim Stanley, who joins me now, wrote a typically brilliant piece for The Spectator just before conference about this. It was entitled, "What Have the Conservatives Ever Done for Us?" And Tim, I'm going to do that annoying thing of reading out your last line. I do recommend everyone reads it, but it's worth starting with your last line, because I think it sums up the piece rather well. This government has pulled off the impressive feat of turning millions of voters off conservatism. Explain what you meant a bit there, please.
Well, I think the full quote is that despite not having governed as conservatives, they've still managed to turn people off conservatism, which is quite an achievement. And what I mean by that is that if you look at the polling, most people now want, most people's emphasis is upon tax and spend in order to deliver good services. I think the problem with this conference, and it's interesting to read my piece and then view the conference and see some confirmation of what I argued. The problem with this conference is it's not focused on the basics of everyday life. It's not really talked about the NHS. It's got nothing to say about tax because they're not touching that. It hasn't really made clear philosophical conservative arguments for typical conservative policies because they're not really implementing any. In fact, Rishi Sunak's speech was quite schizophrenic. This is a conference which is very proud of having introduced same-sex marriage, but now apparently it hates transsexuals. This is a party which pledged in 2010 that it was going to extend HS2 from London Euston to Manchester, but it had the barefaced cheek to announce from Manchester that it wouldn't be doing the Manchester leg of the line anymore. This is the conference which is the party of liberty and the individual, but it'll be banning smoking for young people. There are all these many contradictions, and at the back of the mind of the voter is the greatest contradiction of all, which is being a party of change in government. So Rishi Sunak saying not just that the last 13 years have been one of deadening consensus, but the last 30 years. He's going to overturn 30 years of government and of consensus. A friend messaged me to say, imagine if you were married to the Conservative Party, you'd be demanding a divorce because you've had 13 years of abuse and neglect during which they gaslit you and told you that most of the things you thought were happening were not happening. And then after admitting that those things were happening, they say to you, but stay with me, darling, because I believe I can change. All your friends would be saying, leave him. And I'm afraid that I think most voters right now, whatever Sunak says, however good his intention, and there are individual ministers who I think genuinely do want to change things like Suella Braverman, most voters are going to say, I would feel like an idiot to vote for the party which for the last 13 years has done this. How can you possibly justify that to yourself?
Well, it's interesting, is it not, that there's almost now a nostalgia for the Cameron coalition government, because it's felt widely now that when the Conservatives were working with the Lib Dems, they had more of a drive, they had more of a sense of purpose, of mission, than they do now.
Yeah, I think that's for two reasons. One is because they, of course, were entering government. And you're better at government when you come out of opposition, which is sort of paradoxical because you have less experience of being in government. But what you have done is you've gone away and thought about what you want to do, and you come up with a plan for how to do it. Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings proved you can't do that running. You can't just run straight into office without having properly first figured out how to do stuff. Whereas Cameron and Osborne came in with a set of things they wanted to do, and they got those bits done. And then because they were handcuffed to the Lib Dems, that actually played to Cameron and Osborne's philosophical leaning. They were liberal Tories. And so it meant that some of the harsher stuff around austerity was then softened by Lib Demi type stuff, which they probably would have done anyway, like lifting low-paid workers out of tax. But looking back over the overarching 13 years, there's no getting away from it, that the Tories have never governed as efficiently or radically as when they were in coalition with the Lib Dems. And probably their two biggest achievements in domestic policy in these 13 years have been education and universal credit. And they both began under the Lib Dems. I'm not saying they were Lib Dem policies, far from it. One was Michael Gove's, was very controversial at the time, education, academisation, etc. Same goes with Ian Duncan Smith. The Tories were accused of leading to the deaths of disabled people, etc. Both were very controversial, very typically traditionally conservative policies. But they got them through, they got them done, and we have seen results. And they happened under the Cameron years. Whereas the supposedly most radically conservative, most right-wing period, the post-Brexit period, it's very difficult to say domestically what emerges from that as a legacy.
Well, there are two very big excuses in these 13 years, and you touched on this in your piece. One is Brexit, of course, and of course the Conservatives are the party of Brexit, but there's no denying that the several years spent rowing over Brexit, trying to get Brexit done, has obscured a lot of everything else, got in the way of a lot of other governing. And then, of course, the bigger one in many ways is the pandemic, because that came just at a moment where you had a Brexit government with a significant majority. And even if, as you say, they were sort of car crashing an agenda in, they had an agenda. But the pandemic really did scupper it. I think that's fair to say.
Absolutely. And they were winning elections. They won a historic majority in the midst of the chaos of Brexit. And it's most chaotic during a constitutional crisis. And they were winning by-elections and they were doing well in local elections. So plainly, Brexit did cause political problems. It also led to a number of quite talented politicians leaving the party as a result. So they lost just some of their talent. They lost Cameron over it. They lost Osborne over it. So because they stepped down and said, we don't want to stay in charge for when it's being implemented. So it caused a problem, but it wasn't an electoral liability. On the contrary, it gave the Tories an in to the red wall. The bigger economic, social and political crisis was lockdown. And when I write negatively of the Tories, as I said, I think they've failed to make a case for conservatism. I think they've been very schizophrenic in their policy making. But in their defense, almost every person who was in charge during the lockdown initially got some public support because people rallied around the government of the day and the actions they took. But almost all those governments have been subsequently kicked out. I can only really think of Trudeau still clinging on by his fingertips. So it was very difficult to put your country through lockdown and not pay an electoral price for it. And for the Tories, it's just been deferred because of the nature of the British electoral system.
And another thing you point out in your piece is the growth of British self-hatred, which it's quite a strong tradition in Britain to hate ourselves. But you point out that I think in 2013, 54% of Brits said that Britain was better than most other countries. That's now dropped to 34%. And nobody can ignore the sense of gloom that pervades not just over the Tory party, but over the country generally. There's a sense, and a lot of it is to do with Brexit, I think, there's a sense that this country has lost something.
Yeah, it's to do with the politics of Brexit. It's to do with the economic and social decline that we've experienced because of the pandemic. It leaves the Tories in a difficult position, which is that in 2013, a populist right-wing strategy might have been a 54% strategy. But now it's a strategy that only commands the support of about a third of the country because a lot of people have lost confidence in their country and are not quite so sure about what it stands for anymore or how to articulate those values or how to feel good about it. We've seen in the last few weeks a complete synthesis almost of GB News and the Tory party. The Tory party has doubled down on populism at the same time as the GB News has more sort of solidified its relationship with the Conservative Party. The risk that both of them take in this is that the authority of populism rests on it being popular. What happens if the Tories lose the next election? Where does that leave populists? Because it will send the signal that actually the claim that you are speaking for the silent majority doesn't hold if you're no longer a majority of the public. And it's actually possible that populism has alienated some of that majority and turned it into a minority. It's actually turned some people off the British project. Same as the problem in America, where Trumpites constantly claim that they speak for the real America. Well, it looks from polling like 55% at least of the country is no longer real American by that metric. So I think this is going to be a difficult thing. Brexit has pushed the Tories in a particular direction at the same time as that direction has begun to lose some of its grip over the public because of the chaos and the political controversy associated with it.
And a figure who proved to be popular at conference this year was Liz Truss, of course. And what you're talking about there in terms of the Conservative Party being the party of the working class in many ways, in the future right-wing parties being the party of the working class. Liz Truss's agenda is not something that appeals to the working class, but it is extremely popular with, if you like, the ascendant right in Britain.
Okay. First of all, when she was in power, I wrote sympathetically about her agenda. So I'm not saying this as a critical commentator, but I think the idea that the Tory party conference was in some way bowled over by Liz Truss is not accurate. I attended that meeting that she spoke at, and I would say that a significant number of members had gone along for the same reason that journalists went along, to find out what she had to say and if she would get through it without doing a Lizism. There was a slightly theatrical quality to it. In fact, I think there was a more enthusiastic attendance for the New Conservatives meeting, which is the sort of Boris Johnsonian populist Conservative meeting run by Danny Kruger upstairs a little bit later. So I'm not convinced the party sold on her. I found it curious that Nigel Farage chose to show up to her meeting and associate himself with her, because there's an aspect of Nigel which really connects with the public, which is the anti-immigration, culturally conservative aspect. But on economics, I don't think Britain is a neoliberal economic country. You just look at the polling, it's not. Not only do people not agree with neoliberal economic solutions, they're not their priorities. Their priorities are services like healthcare and education, not tax, growth, business, tech, and all this sort of stuff. So it's a real problem for populism. If it's going to embrace the neoliberalism of Liz Truss, I think it's actually going to find itself losing support. And those people are more likely to gravitate towards Labour, which has worked out that if it can combine a moderately social democratic economic agenda with just staying quiet about culture, there's a lot of votes to be hoovered up.
And you wrote a very funny sketch about Suella Braverman's speech in The Telegraph, but Suella Braverman seems to be possibly emerging as the leading figure of this new conservative movement you're talking about, Danny Kruger and so on. Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It feels as though the next leadership contest is going to be among women. And the most obvious contenders are Suella Braverman, Kemi Badenoch. I don't know about Liz Truss. Maybe not Liz Truss. Maybe Priti Patel on behalf of Liz Truss, and then Penny Mordaunt. So it's all about the women at the moment, which is a fascinating dynamic. But I think Suella Braverman is establishing herself as the natural leader of the populace. And of course, commentators always say she's doing dog whistle, or she's saying this to get votes, or that was a leadership election speech. Yeah, it was, but she also believes in it. And I think of all the people who I've spoken to in the course of this week, I think the person who is most philosophically coherent and consistent is probably Suella Braverman, and is probably the one who touches a chord best with the public. I still think she has some space to grow as a political figure and as a political actor, but nonetheless, I think the new conservative, whatever they call themselves, movement, I think that's probably more likely to win votes in the future than a populist neoliberalism.
There's been a lot of talk, largely, Tim, about the Tory party finally differentiating itself from Labour under Sunak and creating clear blue water, or whatever the phrase is. Do you think there's any truth to that and any validity in it? Do you read anything into a possible tightening into the polls? Or do you think the Conservatives need to have a period out of power in order to regroup and rediscover what they're all about?
Rishi Sunak gave his net zero speech, and there was then one poll which showed that the Labour lead had slipped to 10 points, which is still very high. And so for a little moment, some Tories were excited about that. And then another poll came out that showed the leader something like 22 points, or just something impossible to overcome. The reality is that they're up against their record, they're up against the consequences of lockdown, they're up against the economic conditions. I think it's very difficult for them to overcome that. What they're trying to do under Sunak is establish themselves as the consumer party. And it's interesting to watch Sunak begin to articulate that, to say that politics doesn't work, the public services are not good. The Tory party is going to be, as Suella Braverman said, your trade union. That might work. It would work best in opposition. It's just a difficult argument to make when you're the ones in charge. It's that age-old Tory problem of trying to run against the government when you're in government. And I just think the voters are going. I think everything is going to boil down to I can't get to see a GP for a month, and then it's only a phone call. And I think all the talk about men are men, women are women, control the borders. Even if you agree with all that stuff, it just feels crushingly irrelevant to the very basic everyday problems with government in this country and this sense that it's not working.
Well, and the only thing that people think might stop a Labour government is the shortcomings of Keir Starmer. And I suppose we're going to see that at the Labour Party conference next. Do you anticipate a sort of bold Labour Party presenting its vision to Britain successfully?
I think the Tories have said very little in the last few days. Where they have spoken, it's been on really small stuff, like we won't force you to have 7 bins and we'll try and push back on 20 miles per hour. It's notable how small the Tory stall has been. I think the Labour stall will be even smaller. As I keep joking, we only find out what a Labour Party policy is when they announce that they're no longer going to do it. And I think they'll roll back even on private schools and things like that, leading with nothing. Sunak has tried to introduce the question of trust. And so his definition of trust is me promising as little as possible, but convincing you that I can at least deliver that. Starmer's version of trust is I won't promise anything, so you can't be disappointed because I haven't actually said I'll do anything. And I just don't think that's very exciting, but I still suspect that he can coast into number 10 purely on frustration and anger with the Tory record.
Tim, we'll leave it there, but thank you very much. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Now, the Church of England always used to be known as the Tory party at prayer, but no sane person thinks that's true today. And we have an article by Andrew Roberts in the magazine this week. I'll hold it up because I like doing that. And it's called Meddlesome Priests, the Left-Wing Bias of the House of Lords Bishops. James Heale joins us now, not Andrew Roberts, but a more than adequate replacement for Andrew Roberts. James, how bad is this bias? To what extent is it Tories moaning about the bias, and to what extent is this bias very real?
So Andrew Roberts in this piece analyses voting records in the House of Lords, and he's come up with the staggering statistic that since 2021, the current session of this Parliament, more Labour votes have been cast with the government in the House of Lords than the bishops, which basically means that the bishops really have become, in some ways, the unofficial opposition to the government in the upper house. Now, there's 2 ways to look at this, I think. Robert's case, and the way he makes this argument, is that effectively the leadership of the Church of England has moved to the left since the 1960s, less and less people going to the church, but conversely, the liberal route enacted upon by the leadership of the Church of England has only gone one way, and that's continuing in that direction. The other way to look at it, of course, is that increasingly the Conservative Party and the government have little truck with the Church of England leadership. There was a story, I'm loath to plug other publications, but our ex-intern Tally Fraser wrote a very good piece for Politics Home, which made the Saturday Telegraph splash last week, talking about how Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, had repeatedly refused to meet Justin Welby to discuss the small boats crisis. So I think really it shows the 2 institutions of the state coming apart. The Tory party is less interested in what the Church is saying, and the Church of England is increasingly very vocal about attacking the government. And as Andrew Roberts makes in this piece, points out in this piece, it's a whole range of issues. So the Bishop of Leeds, for instance, has spoken on everything from Boris Johnson's meeting with Alexander Lebedev to the Sue Gray report to voter ID. So it's a whole range of things, not really considered the moral or conscience issues that the Church traditionally would focus on.
It's interesting with Justin Welby, isn't it? Because I remember when he arrived, everyone thought, because there was a lot of moaning about Rowan Williams as Archbishop of Canterbury, that he was a progressive and a lefty, a bearded lefty. But there was a sort of thought that Justin Welby would be more pragmatic, more of an evangelical conservative. That hasn't been the case at all. It's been the complete opposite. Now Rowan Williams seems like a very thoughtful and reasonable spiritual person in comparison.
I was chatting to one Tory MP a few weeks ago who said that only an old Etonian former oilman could embrace the Green left agenda like this. You know? I think that really there's a very sort of series of opinions which are quite fashionable and certain sections of, considered opinion, and the church doesn't really seem to challenge that. I mean, what was also so striking is that, it would be very different if the whole church was going in one direction. But as Robert says in his piece, between 55 and 66% of Anglican worshippers supported Brexit, whereas all 24 bishops and the 2 archbishops at the time supported Remain. So are those views within the church really being reflected at the height of its leadership?
To a large extent, this is the story of us living in a post-Christian society in many ways. And Pope Francis, the Catholics are not immune to it. Pope Francis gave a lecture on the environment. I'm not saying that the environment is necessarily a green issue, but certainly he was sounding a lot more like Greta Thunberg than the previous Pope, Pope Benedict, did when he talked about the environment. And I wonder to what extent it is that the religion of our time now, it's not an original point, but it is progressivism, is identity politics in many ways. And so the Church of England inevitably genuflects before that and follows after the religion of our time.
I think it's very much about the question of the church having faith in what it stands for. And I think there was a third of, let's figure out the other day, saying a third of Church of England the priests don't actually believe, vicars don't believe actually in the resurrection of Christ.
Yeah.
So I think that it's a real case of self-confidence lacking in the church. I think the leadership has been called into question for 60 years or so. I don't see that changing anytime soon. The interesting thing, of course, is that given the change since the 1960s on the theological dimension here, is that going to be reflected in our constitutional elements too? The reason why, of course, we've got this in a sort of political discussion here is that there are 26 bishops and archbishops in the House of Lords. That's always been the case. We've always had an established church. I think some on the right are now questioning whether that should continue to be the case, as you say, Freddie, given that it's increasingly a kind of post-Christian society. And also, in Robertson says in the legislature, the bishops, when they stand up, all the other members of the House of Lords have to sit down because they respect. But his whole point is that kind of revered position in society in the House of Lords, that's no longer being reflected in the society. And I think, although he stopped short of this in his piece, increasingly there is a sense of should those bishops still be allowed to be there in the House of Lords?
Well, it's not a recent thing, isn't it? That the appeal of Anglicanism for a long time has been that it's for hardline Catholics waffly. It doesn't force people to embrace the difficult truths of Christianity, and I mean, but what it did always stand for was tradition, the monarchy, patriotism to a certain extent, and that is something that has vanished from the Church of England, or is vanishing.
Certainly, and I think if you look at the concern around the parishes, the number of churches that have been closed across the country in recent years, that's one element of it. Also, you look at the church's involvement in things which are quite, I think, which are out of step with what its own members believe on, to do with some of the more thorny issues around race and reparations, etc. There's been a bit of anger and disappointment over that. I suppose it's about selective involvement. When you choose to intervene on certain political issues, you're suggesting they should be given more weight and forbearance than others. And I think that, as you say, there's a case perhaps that the Church of England hasn't really been reflecting what the laity would like them to be arguing about and talking about.
And it's interesting, is it, that it doesn't seem to adapt, because it is often more conservative, more evangelical parishes that are thriving, whereas, as Andrew Roberts says, the parishes which embrace kind of very progressive agenda tend to empty out and eventually close. Why do you think the Church of England and other religions can't really see that?
I think it's really interesting, and he talks about how other faiths as well. If I'm making a case political argument for being given representation, you look at those religions that are growing in Britain. Of course, they probably might not be card-carrying Labour types. He makes the point. Jonathan Sacks, of course, was the chief rabbi for many years, and he was seen as having a real affinity with Margaret Thatcher, and his speeches and interventions always reflected that. I'm not too sure as to the reasons why they're sort of failing, but I think that if you look at the kind of path for 60 years, there hasn't been any kind of reversal of that trend towards more liberal Anglicanism. Even that's despite the way in which certain voices like John Sentiment were very popular within the public as a whole. So. Other question is, will the Church of England change anytime soon? I think, judging from their recent church house conferences, probably not.
Probably not, but perhaps the House of Lords might.
Yes.
And the key point here is that people who may have stood up formally for sort of conservative-minded people who believe that it should have an element of stability and tradition within it, and that the church can represent that, they might be up for dissolving the role of the bishops in church or introducing different faiths more now, because certainly those bishops, those spiritual lords, are not in favour of tradition in any way.
It's certainly sort of, might have sort of Catholic representation or Pentecostal representation, to give some examples to broaden it out in the Christian faith. As you said, I think the key point here is that, the concern around balance and if the numbers in the House of Lords really goes back, I'd say, for many decades, but a lot of Conservatives would place the blame squarely on Tony Blair, who then introduced this idea of having the idea that you should mirror the representation of the House of Commons in the House of Lords from the late 1990s onwards. So he got rid of the hereditary peers, and thereafter he wanted to have a certain number of Labour peers reflecting the number of the House of Commons to try and balance that out. Of course, that was really a great pretext for creating huge dozens and dozens of number of new Labour peers. And so I think the whole question of the House of Lords is something that's really risen and fallen throughout the last 10 years or so of Conservative government. But this is one particular issue, those 26 bishops or so. If you're really meant to be these kind of, great speakers of truths and someone who can add sort of moral weight in the House of Lords, but actually you're just reflecting one party view, there are real problems with that. And I think now among certain Tory peers, and I should also say Lord Roberts is one of these, Boris Johnson creation, a real tension there about what they think the future of the upper house should be. And it shows to me how, I think for often a long time, the church, the House of Lords was considered the much more genteel chamber. Increasingly, I think there's much more partisan notes being injected into the upper house.
James Heale, thank you very much indeed. Finally, let's talk about workaholism. A lot of people claim to be workaholics, but are they really? Idris Elba, the actor, has claimed that he is a workaholic, and Douglas Murray, our columnist, has picked up on this point in his latest column. Douglas, first of all, let's start with the obvious point. You would say you might qualify as a workaholic.
It's possible, but I think that Mr. Elba is in some kind of error about one specific thing, which is that he says that he's had to be in therapy for the last year or so because of his workaholic tendencies. He says that one of the problems he's found is that it's better, he finds it better to be, say, 10 days on a film set than sitting on a sofa with his family. And he says there's an added horror in this, which is that the film industry rewards him massively for working like that. And I'm not sure that there's a problem with the incentive structure there. If you're paid a lot of money to do something you do well, like Elba does, then you should do it well. And I think that this, among other things, the pathologization of everything, the medicalization of everything, the therapizing of everything, if that's the term, is not that helpful. Elba is just a very good actor at the height of his powers, and people want to reward him for working well. Now, do some people have a problem with work-life balance? Oh, for sure. But I don't think that's the same thing as forms of drug problems or alcohol problems or anything else. I think it's just another example of the pathologization of what used to be pretty everyday behavior.
Yes. And possibly that we've moved into a different phase of social life and of human life, that we've become confessionaholics.
Yeah, absolutely.
People are addicted to publicly, particularly with social media now, where everyone regards themselves as their own kind of celebrity. People are addicted to talking about the problems that they go through to make themselves seem more interesting.
Yes, and the best way, as you say, is to sort of say, look, I've really been storing this up for a long time, but there's something I've got to confess, and I'm finding it really hard, but help me with this, guys, and I'm in therapy for working too much. And then everyone's meant to say stunning and brave or something like that. And yes, I mean, just sort of gritting your teeth and getting on with it doesn't quite pass mustard anymore. everything's got to be a confession, and as if you've got, as I say, as if you've got problems, when in fact the only problem that Elba has is great success. And as I mentioned in the column, my view is that almost everybody who is successful would count as, in this new pathologizing era, as a workaholic. I know nobody who has made a fortune on their own without inheriting it, who hasn't worked like anything through most of their lives. Now, their children and grandchildren are quite often good at putting their feet up and reflecting on the nature of themselves. But it's not common that people who actually are self-made and successful, sort of have a lot of me time. The most obvious example I give in the column is Elon Musk. People sort of think it's weird that Elon Musk slept on the floor of one of his Tesla factories when he was trying to get the model through. Well, that's an example of somebody who would qualify as a workaholic, but he also produced the most successful non-diesel powered car and is currently working to get to Mars. And that's not somebody who really needs to put their feet up a lot more or have a lot more me time. That's somebody who's doing stuff, and that's admirable. I don't think it should be sort of medicalized.
Yes. And to what extent one of our sections on this show, we were talking about sort of living in a post-Christian society. And of course, Max Weber and the Protestant work ethic, probably one of the most important books of the last 200 years in some ways, identified the importance of Protestantism and its work ethic in the development of human civilization, of Western civilization. Do you think, to not to get too serious about it, but do you think that that's what's going on here, is that we've actually lost the sense that work is an integral part of what it is to be a human being, what it is to be fulfilled?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned in the piece, most workaholics are workaholics because they are doing a task that they enjoy and or are good at. You can be a workaholic in an area of work that you don't like, and usually that's for another reason, which is that you're providing for loved ones, and that's a particularly male characteristic and a very noble characteristic. But yes, I mean, there's definitely the sense that a falling away of a certain form of, as you said, what you described as a Protestant work ethic. A famous hymn, which I'm going to mangle and misquote, but who sweeps a floor as for thy laws makes that and the action fine. A famous 19th century hymn. The idea being, whatever you do, if you do it for the right cause, in that case for God, then it doesn't matter whether you're sweeping floors or doing anything else. I think there's definitely a sort of sense, particularly in the work societies that we've created now, that unless you're totally happy with your job, you should sort of move on and find something that suits you more. And that's partly because the largest significant change in work ethic in the last 60 years has been the movement from the person who does a job, however menial, but provides for their loved ones, being a person of worth, becoming the person doing a menial job is a loser. And that obviously has changed the whole spectrum.
Or is it that we have become spoilt, not just financially as the world's become richer, but spoilt by pleasure? In the sense that now when people have to do work which often isn't pleasurable, even if you enjoy your work, there are bound to be parts of it that you don't enjoy. But anything that you don't enjoy is seen to be triggering or damaging somehow. Is that a problem?
Well, that's definitely. I mean, all of the surveys show millennials who don't want to go back to the office for more than 30 minutes a week, and that's for the lunch hour. That stuff is definitely a problem, and it's something that's obviously been exacerbated by lockdowns and events of recent years. I mean, I mentioned that there's a famous iceberg of success that some school children are still shown, that everything below the surface is all the work that creates the ability to see anything above the surface. And not to get too autobiographical, but I mentioned in the piece, for the first 7 years or so of my own career, I never went on holiday. I didn't once. I couldn't afford to, and I couldn't pass up the opportunity of work. And a lot of people, when they're starting off, have that experience. You don't dare say no to anything because you fear that if you say no to anything, even for 1 week, you might not get asked again. Well, I mean, is that healthy? I think so, actually, when you're starting off, because when you're starting off in any career, you better pedal like hell. And the idea that the world owes you endless time to reflect or, relax is just not true. And apart from anything else, and I fear this is particularly the case in British culture at the moment, apart from anything else, it suggests that there are sort of several options in life, one of which is to sort of put your feet up. And this isn't theoretical, by the way, as we've commented a lot in the magazine. 1 in 5 people who are of working age and perfectly fit and able to work in our major cities do not work and are paid by the state not to work. Well, there's many, many times the population of Britain in China who are willing to work many, many times what the hardest working people in our society work in order to get the lifestyle that we seem to think is our right, and it isn't. So I wish there was a little bit more workaholism in the UK. We could do with it, and we could do with a bit of shaming, actually, of the people who just want to put their feet up, sit around and eat Doritos until the perfect job comes around, because it's not going to.
Yes. Although you sounded quite tempting, the Doritos tempting me slightly, but you also touch on an important. You are a confessionaholic to a certain extent because you're a columnist, and you touch on the fact that you've come to realise that your irritability is monetizable. Can you explain?
Well, I mean, you know that better than anyone, Freddie, having been on the receiving end of my irritability many a time. No, I do mention that. I mentioned in passing that, of course, everything in America is medicalised in particular, and that of course, now comes to the UK. I mentioned that a friend of mine from California recently told me that he'd been given a new medication by his doctor that was to treat his slight irritability. And we talked about it. He said it somewhat helped him in the workplace. And he asked if I wanted to try it. And I said it's a hard no for 2 reasons. The first is there aren't enough pills to truncheon my intense irritability with almost everything. Almost everything in the world. And secondly, that if I was to truncheon myself with anti-irritability medicine, within about a fortnight, I think I'd be completely out of work. Because I'd be writing, at best, columns about the joys of spring, the fact that kittens are quite nice, puppies are charming, and I think I'd be writing, without any insult to country life, I might manage about 2 columns a year for country life about voles or something.
You do write about poetry. Irritability is not your only.
Oh yes, I mean I write about a whole range of things. I don't just write about the things that annoy and aggravate me. I also try to write about things that I love. But it is quite a good test for a writer to just check your irritability at the irritating things of the world. And I would think that the first thing you do when you get up in the morning is just to check that you're still irritated by all of the human idiocy which lays itself out before us every day like a great buffet. And if it doesn't spark some kind of response, then the chances are that you've overindulged in something else the night before.
Yes, look in the mirror, and if you don't hate yourself, you should be worried. Yeah, that's.
I don't have that one, Freddie. I think that's one you have, but I don't get it.
Okay, yeah, that's I don't look that much in the mirror because of that. Douglas, I would love to carry on talking about this, but I can't be bothered to carry on this conversation.
And I'm finding it quite irritating.
It's quite. I'm getting irritated. So we'll wrap it up there. But
and I've got work to do. I've got work to do, Gray, unlike some of you.
Yeah. I'm going to go off and feed some other addiction. That's it for this week. I hope that you have bothered to watch us all the way through to the end of the show. I'm sure you have. Otherwise, you wouldn't be listening to me right now. Before we wrap this up, I should thank our sponsors, Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, for sponsoring the week in 60 minutes. Canaccord will provide you with the experience you need to help you build your wealth with confidence. Visit candowealth.com for more information.